everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of Eat, Drink, Write, an Urban Fantasy Whiteboard. I am Sherry Ellison.
And I'm Taylor Ellison.
And today we're going to talk about subplots. So first, what are you drinking?
A margarita.
Yummy. I am drinking a vodka soda with extra lime.
Yum.
And what are we eating?
Chips and salsa for me.
And I've got some keto chips that are actually avocado chips and some cheese dip that I can also have the salsa with those and the cheese dip. So.
No, the salsa's mine.
It's all yummy. I wanted to remind everybody that we do have that contest going. It is where our listeners can win free merch. And we have posted it all over our social media. I think we talked about it during the last episode. What you have to do is subscribe on iTunes and leave a review, and then email us. You don't have to leave the review on iTunes. You can leave it wherever you want to. Just email us so we know where to find it. Email us your address so we can send you all the good stuff. We've got spiral notebooks, sticky notepads, and some magnetic calendars for you guys. And again, we have listeners all over the world, which is so cool to me.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank all of you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. It's awesome.
Okay, so let's jump into subplots. And I think you said you've got an actual definition for us.
I do have a definition. So, we talked a little bit about main plots last episode, but subplots are also equally important, I think. And so the definition I have is that it's a secondary plot or side story that unfolds along with the main plot. It adds complications and obstacles for your main character, and it adds to story conflict.
I like that. That's a good definition.
Yeah.
You can have subplots. A lot of the stories in urban fiction are series. And so you can have subplots that carry throughout more than one book.
Yeah.
Or you can have subplots that are even in a tiny part of the book. It might just be in the beginning and that particular subplot gets done, or it could last the entire book.
Right.
But it does have to carry the main plot line. It has to, what is the word? Move that main plot forward.
Drive it, yeah.
Drive that plot. So, yeah, it needs to advance the main plot. That was the word I was looking for.
Advance,
yes. I'm a writer. And it should help the story be richer.
I think it's really important to put as much thought into a subplot as you do your main plot.
I think so too.
Because I feel like if your subplot falls short, then it's gonna leave a dissatisfying read for your audience.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I like the fact that it might be a subplot, not that your main character is having to deal with, but it could be a subplot of a secondary character.
Oh yeah.
Which then makes that secondary character important too.
Yeah, and I think that makes the book so much richer when you do bring in secondary characters and give them their own issues, and because they're people too and they have their own desires and what they want to do. So bringing in those conflicts and seeing how it affects the main plot of your novel, I think can just make the story that much richer.
I think so too, and I love secondary characters. Some of the stories that I read, my favorite character is not necessarily the main character. I love the secondary character.
Yeah, definitely.
But it can also, in addition to driving the main plot, it can interrupt the main plot. So yeah. So you've got your plot where she's supposed to, solve this crime or travel to this place, but this subplot might pop up, and it can be a rock in and of itself. Right. We talked about throwing rocks.
Yeah.
And so this subplot, this secondary character perhaps is in danger, and the main character has to go and help the secondary character, which is not necessarily where she was originally going.
Right.
So it's they can be rocks.
True.
Which also helps create tension in your book, because we're, as the reader, sitting here going, but you're supposed to be going over here.
Please go that way.
Why are you going over here? But then you understand it because she's got some reason to go and pursue this secondary plot.
Right.
It makes the world more real, I think.
I agree. Because, that's how it happens. You have your main plot, my main plot is to go to work and make money and whatever, and then I have my own little subplots to life where, I like to play World of Warcraft, and I like to hang out with my family on the weekends, and I'm dating someone. So, that kind of thing, it's very reminiscent of real life.
I think so too. I like that too. They can be humorous as well, which
Yeah.
I am a big fan of humor.
I feel like that's probably your favorite type of subplot.
I think so. I rarely, well, I don't say rarely. My favorite book plot has lots of humor anyway.
Yeah.
That is, I'm the lighter edge of the genre as opposed to the darker edge of the genre, although I have written some dark ones. But I enjoy the humorous ones, and I love when my characters make me laugh out loud. I mean, it's just, I love it.
I mean, you and your fairies.
I absolutely. In my very first book that I'm working on now, which is why I'm talking about it because it's fresh in my mind right now, one of my secondary plots or subplots is a bumbling apprentice who is, I mean, and he gets himself into so much trouble, and it's so funny. He is a trip. Whereas meanwhile, the main plot is not always happy and fun. There's, death and all kinds of evil things happening. So to have Clinton as this bumbling apprentice who stumbles onto these things.
It gives a little bit of comedic relief.
It is. Yeah. It is. Yeah. And that's part of what a subplot can help as well with, is comedic relief when you have really dark things going on. Yeah.
Well, along those same lines, I do have a list of types of subplots.
Oh, what's that? What you got?
So I got this from this website article, ezinearticle.com by John Hallis. I had never heard of this before, but
I've never heard of it.
He had some really interesting information. So the first one is romance, a romance subplot, which I think is pretty typical in a lot of books. I don't think it's necessary to have a romance subplot. I know a lot of things say that you should, but I think it's one of the more common subplots.
Do you have romance subplots in any of your books?
I think literally all of them.
Every one of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
And that's just kind of how it worked out, especially when I start getting characters together and, they're talking and sometimes it just happens. So therefore I have one. The second one is a political subplot.
Oh.
So things, I guess, dealing with politics in the world, which, in my current work, I'm dealing with Mac and she's exposed magic. And that's going to be a lot of political downfall on her.
Mm-hmm. Within the magical community that she knew nothing about?
She still doesn't really know anything about it. But no, just even in terms of, in general, politics, because suddenly magic exists.
In my book, that very first book with Clinton, the apprentice, there is a lot of political subplots going on because she is queen. And so that brings the politics of people who want to take over her throne, and people, the whole politics of, she's young, and so she has to learn how to, she is not very filtered, so it's hard for her to learn how to be politic. So there is a lot of political weaving and plotting going on in that particular book.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that. Mm-hmm. The third one that I want to talk about was historical subplots, which I think, you have background of your world and say that something's happened in the past and it affects what is going on in the plot now. That's how I took it.
And back to that same, using this work I'm working on right now. Yeah. Something happened ages ago, so long ago that people don't even remember it.
Right, and I imagine it affects what's going on in your main plot.
It does. So I guess I've got a little bit of a historical
subplot which, too. A lot of these on this list I had never really thought about, and I agree with most of them, and we'll get to the ones where I'm I don't quite understand, but it's interesting. So the fourth one is a character subplot. So I think that's what we were talking about with the secondary characters.
Say that one again?
The character subplot.
Character subplot. I'm sorry, I'm being distracted by my dog. She's sitting at the door crying because we have locked ourselves away.
We've locked ourselves away with food.
Yes, intentionally locked ourselves away, in part due to the food, but she's out at the door crying, so I'm sorry about that.
No worries. Character subplots. So I think that's what we were talking about earlier with secondary character.
Oh, true.
Subplots.
Okay.
Which can, I think, affect main plots a lot as well. Then there's one called a macabre subplot.
Macabre.
And I had no idea what he was talking about when I was reading about it at first, but the way that he explains it is that it's an explanation of a villain's intentions. And so what I got from that was in say you're reading George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones
Okay.
books, and I've only seen the series, so sorry if I butchered the books. But in my head, I imagine he does. He's got all these main characters that he goes with, and then he's got his villain, and he can go to his villain's point of view and do some things there, and you get to see what the villain is doing, what the antagonist is doing. There's another series I read called the Sword of Truth series. And
I never did read that one.
Yeah, and it's a high fantasy, and it follows two main characters, Richard and Kaelin, and for the most part, it just follows them, and it's their point of views. But every now and then, we'll get a chapter from the villain's point of view and what he's doing, and he leaves it where it's just like, oh, the villain's up to something, something's going to happen in the future, this is why he's doing it. We kind of get a glance into the villain's path.
Do you think that to have that kind of subplot, you have to actually go to that character's point of view, or can you see that subplot through the eyes of a different character?
That's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could. Well, to be honest, I think you can do literally anything with writing.
I mean, true. Like, I was trying to think in Karen Moaning, her Fever series, we didn't ever necessarily get into Kavruck's head throughout the story.
Right.
But we saw the subplots that were going on through the eyes of our other characters, seeing what was happening.
I think that would count.
I think so too.
Because that still counts as a subplot.
Because we're seeing it and living it, and it is a distraction, and it is a separate plot from the main plot line.
Right.
Interesting. That is the first time I ever thought of that.
Same. And to call it a macabre subplot, I had never heard a term like that before applied to plots, like a macabre plot. I don't know. I just never...
It could also mean horror.
True.
There are horror plots, too, within... Or there can be. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, no, this is how he explained it, was the villain's intentions.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So the next one is so now we're starting to get into the ones where I've never experienced it myself. I've never read anything about these kinds of things. So this one is artful and environmental subplots. So when I was reading about it, he said, your environment can be changing, or your environment can also affect the plot. So think about like climate change that we're going through right now.
I was thinking maybe earthquakes.
Yeah.
That would be an environmental subplot that helps create tension. And
so my dad really likes end of the world movies, natural disaster movies, and that like in itself is just it's the main plot in that case. But in any other novel where you have an earthquake and they're like gradually getting worse, or an incoming hurricane, I think would also count as like an environmental subplot.
And it could increase tension because you're fighting against time with a hurricane. It's coming and you're trying to get certain things done or get to a certain place before that disaster happens.
Right.
Interesting. And then artful, what is artful?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure how to explain that one, and he didn't have much explanation of it himself, so I didn't write too many notes on it.
Maybe our listeners will have some ideas of what that means, or maybe they've used that themselves. I'd love to hear it if you have.
Yeah. And then the last subplot that he has is a thought path, is what he calls it. And in my mind, that means it's inner character development.
Okay.
And it's more about the way a character thinks as they go through the novel. And does that thinking change? Are they a different person by the end of the book?
Because every book should, I think, have character development. The characters got to grow.
Agreed.
And so to categorize that as a subplot is interesting to me, because I guess it is a subplot. Mm-hmm. Because it's not the main thing, she's got to go save the world.
Right.
It's the thoughts and her feelings and how her perception is changing during the course of her going to save the world. So
yeah, exactly.
That makes sense. Interesting.
Yeah, so I thought that was pretty neat. Those are the 7 subplots that he listed, and I thought all of them were really interesting, and some of them were, I don't know what artful subplots are.
Yeah, I'm curious. I might have to ponder that and come up with some thoughts.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, so what else did you have?
Oh, just to follow up on that thought path subplot.
Yes.
Which is about their thoughts. I think emotional growth is also a subplot that kind of goes hand in hand with character development. Mm-hmm. I think, thoughts and emotions are tied into one. And I think that should definitely be included on a list of subplots.
Yeah, that makes sense too.
Yeah.
I talked about how subplots a lot of times are like rocks. I mean, I think you could probably characterize subplots as rocks, throwing the rocks. Every subplot is going to make things more challenging for your character.
Yeah.
It might be a happy subplot, maybe someone's gotten pregnant and this is a great thing, but for your main character it creates problem because they're trying to do something else, and that wrinkle makes their main goal more challenging.
Right.
So even we talk about rocks, but a rock doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be
for sure
something that just makes things more difficult on our main character.
Yeah.
In Frickin' Fairies, Beck's main goal is to try to help the fairies, and they've lost a gem that they, quote, borrowed from this other group, and this other group, the Naga, are trying to kill the fairies now. And so that's the main goal of that book, is she's trying to help the fairies.
Right.
But I added in subplots. I've got an elf who ends up owning her, which I think I talked about earlier.
You mentioned it a little bit.
She has a friend who gets kidnapped in order to...
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So...
Forgot about that.
Yeah. And it's her best friend. He owns this bookstore with her. And he gets kidnapped because these people that kidnap her think that they can use him as leverage to get her to do something that they want. There's a girl in trouble that she helps and then brings down an entire race of people on her head because she didn't understand the politics of this Fae culture. And honestly, even if she had understood it, she probably would have done it anyway.
It's a classic Beck move.
It was a classic Beck move. And then I've got a romantic subplot with this
the elf
guy that owns her. And then she has her ex-husband who is trying to control her and keep her safe, while he's married to someone else who hates Beck because she feels like her husband is still somehow involved with Beck, which he's not. They met really young. They met in high school and they married in high school. So all of these subplots are going on in Frickin' Fairies, which help drive this main goal of saving the elves, or help throw rocks at her in her efforts to save the fairies.
Right, yeah.
What else do you have?
I have notes on how to come up with subplots.
Great.
So I typically look at my cast of characters, and so this is more like a, secondary character subplot type of way of coming up with subplots. And you gotta... look at them like they're people. What do they want? What are their desires? Does it conflict with your main character's desires?
And do you think it's a good thing when it does?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Too.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if they don't either, but I think you're going to have more tension and you're going to have more conflict in story if they do clash.
I agree.
And it's a lot more fun to write, in my opinion.
I think so too.
Yeah, so what is the main goal for each of them? If it conflicts with the main characters, what are the issues that's going to cause? What are the challenges that are keeping them from their own goal? And, outline their stories just like you would your main characters. And I think that's a really good way to at least start looking at subplots with your stories.
So, how do you do that? It's one thing to say, that this is where I'm thinking we go back to the plot generators.
Right.
Because sometimes my mind just goes blank. I look at all my characters and I'm just going, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, but if you've come up with a character, you have to have some kind of idea of who they are, right? What do they want?
Maybe you start thinking about those secondary characters and their lives. You start developing their backgrounds and their stories, and maybe that will lead to a subplot.
Definitely. I think that's actually necessary, is to outline your characters and to get to know them like you know your main character. Because say you have your main character, and she's outgoing, and she wants to be everywhere, and she wants to talk to all these people, and then you have the secondary character, who's maybe her roommate by random choice or whatever, by random assignment in a college town or something like that, and the roommate is like, I don't want to talk to people, I'm a loner, whatever, but then your main character is like, I want to throw a party this weekend. And that's going to cause some conflict.
Yeah.
And there is a little subplot there, because maybe the roommate will start having resentment. Or maybe the roommate will be like, oh, I met someone at one of your parties. You're going to have...
I was just about to say, and then that party could spark the next subplot.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think, just take a look at who you have in your cast, and if you have ideas for characters already, then I think you can go somewhere. And I think, I talked a little bit last week about my methods of finding a plot.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could do that with all of your characters as well. So
I like that idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that I was thinking of as far as subplots go is we had talked about shadow characters before.
That's right, yeah.
And those characters can be really handy in increasing tension, but they can also be the subplots like you were just talking about.
Right.
Think of your character having to deal with a shadow character to obtain something that they need.
Right.
So you need, in a typical fantasy, you're going on a quest.
Yeah.
And you need an item to go on the quest.
Right.
So in order to get that item, you have to deal with this person that you need this item from. And that could be a shadow character, which would be a subplot of how difficult it is to get this item. She's got to overcome this issue to get whatever it is that she needs to move on with her
quest. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. So I did have some stuff from last week's episode that I wasn't able to get to, but it fits with subplots.
Okay.
And one of those was backstory. I think backstory needs to be a part of your main plot, but it can also be a subplot, I think, because everybody that you talk to about writing will say, "Oh, sprinkle your backstory throughout the novel. Don't dump it all in the exposition." And so I think that inherently can make it a subplot.
A subplot.
Right.
That's a very good thought. I hadn't thought of that as being a subplot. I mean, to me, it's necessary, and to me, it happens. But I never thought of it as being a subplot in and of itself.
Yeah,
but
I think so.
I think you're right.
Because I think it also lends to the character growth. Because if you know some backstory, Mac was, in my current work, Mac was a foster kid. And so she's obviously going to have some issues. I think we talked about it before with like character flaws and like that kind of thing.
And backstory can also bring in subplots in that there are going to be relationships from the past that might pop up in this work. And so backstory can help bring those characters in. It could add another character to the story. Someone shows up from her foster world in the past that was trouble, that was always trouble. This is not the time she needs it because she's dealing with all of this backlash from outing magic. I mean, maybe this character from her backstory shows up thinking, oh, she's magic. She can give me something.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
I like that.
Yeah, I think it can definitely lend to current subplots, and it can be a subplot on its own. I think it also adds to tension, which was another point that I had for last week that I wasn't able to get to. And you want to have conflict in every scene. Every scene should be its own little 3-act story. And I think subplots are along the same lines. Your subplots need to be a full story.
Do you think there's ever a time when you can have too many subplots, or is that not such? Is there no such thing?
No, I think there is such a thing as too many subplots. I feel like it would make speaking personally, I think it would make my books too complicated. I feel like it would bog down the story that I'm trying to tell, I guess.
And your reader might get too overwhelmed and say, you know what, I don't care about anybody.
Overwhelmed and confused.
Too much going on. I don't care about this story anymore.
Yeah, so in my opinion, I think you can have too many.
So how do you come up with that balance of, I mean, for me, it's just what feels right.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to explain how I know
how many is too many, which ones are right, and which whatever. So I do have a few things about that, but it ties into weaving subplots into a story.
Okay.
Which I know you have some notes on too. So before we move to that, do you have anything else?
Nope, that was everything I had so far.
Okay, cool. So weaving subplots into a story is like a whole thing on its own. I feel like it's a whole other beast. And
when you started writing, you did not agree with me on the term of weaving. That you were
I know. I was very against it for some reason, which, now, as I am now, like, I completely understand. Yeah.
But, I mean, to me, each subplot can be, okay, so think in your brain about pieces of thread, and that your book is a tapestry, and you are weaving in these stories, and So, like when we were writing Kitten, the werewolf story, we would have this thread and something would happen, and that's where the needle goes into the canvas or into the tapestry. And then it stays under the tapestry and all this other stuff is going on, and then it comes back up, just like a needle and thread, and it's being woven into this tapestry. And I love that concept. I have always thought in terms of weaving a story.
I like it a lot now too, so I was adamantly against it, and that might have been rebellious teenage.
It could be.
I don't like it.
You were young when we started that book, and you were learning on your own too.
Yeah, definitely. So. And now, I mean, I've been writing for upwards of 8 years now, so I've learned a lot, and I completely agree with the weaving analogy. I think it makes a very good image for, explaining how a plot works for a book.
And, okay, so we talked about plot holes last week. When you have a plot hole, weaving allows you to pop up that part of the subplot and mend that hole.
Yeah.
You just envision sewing or weaving, this...
I think your tapestry analogy was
this
was
thread
good.
Comes up, you've got a hole, this thread can pop up when we hadn't had it in there originally and mend that hole.
Yep.
And it allows you to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Do you have a specific technique to go about weaving your subplots into your stories?
I don't. It's kind of the way I cook. It just, until it looks
until
right.
It looks
until
right.
it feels right.
Ask her for a recipe and you don't get one.
Yeah, sorry. I failed my children because I'm just like, until it looks right. But, I'll be reading, and I write differently than you write. You write straight through and then rewrite.
Yep. I
rewrite as I'm going.
Right.
And I still have to rewrite after. But I perfect, and perfect is used loosely. Nothing is perfect. But I write and rewrite all the way through. So I do have these little strands so that, and sometimes it's just this amazing, oh my God, this thread would go perfectly here, and I tug it and I weave it in, and it's just amazing.
And it works.
Yeah, it does. I was thinking about Game of Thrones, like you were talking about Game of Thrones, and you talk about thread. That man's tapestry is incredibly woven.
Intricate.
It is. The Wheel of Time series. Have you read The Wheel of Time?
You asked me that last week.
I'm sorry. I forgot. I know Courtney's read it.
Yeah, I have. Courtney has read it. I have the first book, but I haven't read it yet.
That series, high fantasy again. I mean, obviously you can tell we love fantasy and
Definitely.
Whatever, whether it's horror fantasy or high fantasy or urban fantasy, we love all fantasy. But The Wheel of Time is an incredible story from, just like Game of Thrones, you have all these characters. But I would say that both Game of Thrones and Wheel of Time are more, rather than weaving, they're more parallel plot lines.
Oh. Well, I think Game of Thrones has, parallel plot lines as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that those books are more parallel stories, which I'm starting to think this book I'm working on now, my very first book, might have to become a parallel plot line. Because I can't... I'm going to need help with this. The main character is extremely naive. She's very young. She's not super likable because she was raised in, think about along the lines of Dungeons and Dragons, back the old Dungeons and Dragons, because I wrote this, it was 30, 40 years ago that I started writing this book.
But you're only 29.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right. No, silly me. So it had the good, evil, neutral type thing.
Right.
I don't know what I was talking about now.
You were talking about parallel plot lines. And you were talking about how...
Okay. So because she is ultimate good. How interesting is that?
Yeah.
That is not super interesting.
Right.
And I've got one that's super evil, ultimate evil. And she's not interesting. When you have that kind of total black and white, it is not...
Which, I get your problem with it, because I also know the end. And it ties in beautifully.
It does, but I'm thinking to write it, I might need to use parallel lines so that I have... I'm thinking of The Wheel of Time, which you haven't read. But,
I know.
But, there are so many characters, and it's their individual timeline, and yes, they interconnect, and I think that may be how I'm going to have to write this, because we can only take so much of Kayla at one time before we're just like, she is stupid, she is young, she
too
is
much of a Mary Sue.
Too much of a Mary Sue.
Yeah.
And she has to be that way. And her twin sister has to be the other way. That is the way this book has to go. Which I can't say why, because I don't want to give up what's going on.
Right.
But because of that, I think I'm going to have to write chapters from the point of view of her spiritual advisor. And,
oh, yeah.
you know, from the people on their quest. It's a definite high fantasy where there are quests and things that have to go on. But they pick up these characters as they go, and so I've got other people I can further the plot through writing from their points of view.
Definitely. I think that'd be a good idea.
I think that's the only way I'm going to be able to get through this story.
Yeah. Which sounds like it'll be fun to rewrite.
I am very excited about it.
Because one of my favorite things to do with my books is to go back and like write a scene from a different point of view and like how that character views it.
That's a great idea.
Oh, it's one of my favorite things to do. It is
I have
so much
never
fun.
done that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun because it gives you a different perspective and from a different viewpoint of that conflict.
That's brilliant. I have not done that. I'm definitely going to have to use that.
It's a lot of fun. It's definitely one of my favorite things to do with my books and my characters, because I love all of my characters too. Like, I'm very attached to like my secondary characters, so it's fun to write from their points of view.
Yeah.
And kind of see, you know, what's going on in their head as this giant event is happening. And you've already written it from the main character's point of view. So like, what are they thinking about? So it's fun to do. I recommend it.
So what else did you have on weaving?
So I'm gonna go back to the David Moss book that I've been working with, and he actually has a whole chart that he uses to create and weave subplots into the main plot.
Really?
It's really neat. So I'll go through it, and again, it's David Moss in the writing the breakout novel books. I can't recommend it enough. He's got some really good information in it. He's got a workbook that goes along in it that you can use for your own books if you're writing. So I'll go through this weaving a story chart, and I've used it, and it's kind of like a plot generator.
Okay.
In the way that it is, and I'll just go through it really quick.
Okay.
So you make 3 columns. The first column is your characters. So list out all the characters in your novel.
Okay.
The second column is your narrative lines, and what that is a summary of that character's story or goal.
For each of the characters that
for
you
each
put
of those characters.
Okay.
So make sure you give yourself enough space to write it out.
Okay.
Or if you're doing it on the computer, then it doesn't matter as much. But you're going to write out a summary of their story or goal, like their main problem, their plot layers, their any ideas for subplots that you already have for those characters. Go ahead and write that down.
Okay.
And then your third column is going to be settings. So places that those characters spend time.
Oh.
So for his examples were, like their home or their workplace, or do they have a favorite bar, or do they own a business? So places where they spend time. So you have those 3 columns, and now that you have those, use circles and lines to connect them and weave them together. So use circles and lines to make connections between each of those characters. So it's, you have your main character who spends time in their favorite bar. What other character is going to go to that bar?
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. And so do this randomly.
Okay.
So don't even think about, what I just said. Is that character going to go to that bar?
Right. You're not even trying to come up with that at that point.
So do it randomly and see what happens. And if something in your brain is just like, oh, I like that character is going to go to that bar. What's going to happen if they go to that bar?
Mm-hmm.
Their story is telling them this. How is their story going to interact with another character who's going to end up at that same bar? Is there any conflict there? And if there's not, it's fine. It's random lines, and that connection doesn't have to happen. But if you make those random connections, and for some reason they seem to work out, and you have a story there, use it.
Interesting. I think we do a lot of this subconsciously ourselves.
I think so too.
Speaking exactly of that issue with the bar in Frickin' Fairies, there is a bar that a whole bunch of people end up at the same time through, it was not on purpose I didn't plan it.
Right.
and it worked.
Yeah.
And it did lead to a subplot of something else that's going to happen later.
Yeah.
And other books.
Exactly. I've used this story chart, and it's great because like I was like random lines. This is not gonna work. It's gonna be stupid. All of these connections are gonna be stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were like some of them I was like that's not gonna work.
Mm-hmm.
But some of them were like, oh, this is really interesting. I didn't even think about these two characters crossing and what their stories would mean to each other.
Yeah.
And so I got a subplot out of that.
Oh, how neat.
Yeah, super neat. And by doing that, you have a way of weaving it into your story, because if they do interact with that main character, or if they interact with another character that's important to the main plot, you're automatically weaving it into your plot. So even if it is a subplot, it's still important to that main plot.
That's interesting, because in this bar scene in Frickin' Fairies,
Mm-hmm.
something happened when these characters that I didn't expect to meet met, which led to the epiphany that I got and tying everything up at the end. It was totally unexpected.
Yeah.
But it did. It led to this little subplot that advanced my main plot to
And
where I
helped
needed it to go.
Bring it all together.
Yeah. It was amazing.
Yeah, so that's that story chart that I have, and I've used it for multiple novels. I've especially used it for my Aura series, and I've done that. That's not on a one book scale. That's on a multiple book scale. And I did it instead of for subplots. I actually used it for main plots.
Which, I think we need to do another podcast about series plots.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Because a lot of fantasy is series.
Mm-hmm.
Not just
especially urban
fantasy.
fantasy.
Especially urban fantasy.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever read a standalone urban fantasy.
Patricia Briggs actually had a standalone.
Is it urban fantasy?
No, it might be. It might not have been.
I'm pretty sure she did high fantasy, and Mercy
it
was her
high
first
fantasy. You're
urban
right.
fantasy.
You're right. But I think that we could talk a whole lot about how to go about, because this is something that I have struggled with, because all of my stories are series. How do you make this overarching plot go? Especially like with Frickin' Fairies, there's no definite end to that.
Right. That could go on forever.
Yeah, it could go on forever. So how do I keep an overarching plot line going?
I think that would make an interesting episode.
Yeah, so we'll have to do that. Let us know if that's something that you all want us to do. But I think we might do that even maybe next week, since we're on plots right now.
That's true.
But we'll go from there. I think that's a good idea. We'll research it and see if we can come up with enough for an episode.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Do you have any more on subplots?
So I think that's mostly it. I think I have, don't let it overpower your main plot.
Mm-hmm.
You have a main plot for a reason, so I think make sure that that's in the forefront. And if one of your subplots is overpowering it, then maybe that should be your story.
That's true. Good point.
And this is general you. I'm not trying to teach. This is how I think about like my works.
Yeah, neither one of us are have the authority to teach, but it's just fun to talk about and to explore these ideas.
I think so too. So I think it's important to not let it overpower your main plot, or if it does, then maybe you should rethink your story.
Yeah, maybe the story. I was having problems with my Hello series. It's an elemental series about elementals and the alignments of planets and things that it's interesting, but it's a romance. What was my point?
I don't know.
What were we talking about?
I've had most of my margarita now.
Yeah, mine's gone.
Oh, I know what you were going to say. We were talking about not letting it overpower your main plot.
Oh, so when I was writing Hello, I came to a point where I was struggling, and I realized I had started with the wrong character. Mm-hmm. So my series, my elemental series, is going to be from a different point of view of a different person in each book. And as I was writing Hello, who I started as she was my first character, I realized her sister Yesmare was actually the starting point. Yeah. And so I ended up having to start Yesmare's story, and Hello's is going to weave in and out of that same timeless. Things are going to have occurred at the same time in those two books, but I realized
Hello needed to be a subplot.
Yeah, Hello, and not necessarily a subplot, but she was a separate book.
Sure.
She was a secondary book.
But she will be a subplot, like in your first book.
Yes, in my first book, she will be. So, yeah, it was interesting how that, and I'm still working on that series, and I actually have had one of the other siblings. There's a whole bunch of siblings that are coming through. So I'm not really sure now who is going to be first.
Right.
Because as I started writing Yes, Murray, I realized, I don't know.
Yeah.
So that was what my point was, is that, you might have to change your story. Don't get yourself stuck and saying, this is my story, this is my main character, this is how it has to go, because it
doesn't have to
be. It
Yeah.
might not be. Keep yourself open to change.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Okay.
And then the last thing I have is make sure your subplots are resolved in some manner by the end, whether that end is 10 books from now
Right.
or the same book.
Yeah, don't leave your reader hanging.
Yeah, because that will be very dissatisfying for
Yes,
them. And
definitely
need an end to subplots. Because I think just like your main plot, they also have a beginning, middle, and end.
I agree.
So.
You have interview questions for us this week?
I do. I have one. If you could pick any urban fantasy world to visit, which one would it be and why?
Oh my gosh. I would like to visit so many.
I know. I couldn't really pick one either. I mean, I can. I have one picked out, but it's really difficult to...
It is. I kind of think, there's several that I would be curious to visit, like Karen Moniz's world. I don't know that I want to visit it as it ends up,
yeah,
because it's a little scary.
It's a little spooky.
I think maybe the Grave Witch.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because there's folded.
Yeah.
And you can go into fairy, and you have these fairy bars that are nexuses between the fairy world.
No, that's a great choice.
I think that would be, I would love to go visit. I wouldn't want to live there.
No.
Because there's too many things, the fae in that world are very
I don't know that
scary.
I want to live in any of the urban fantasy worlds. I mean...
Well, and I was also thinking about Kate Daniels. But
I thought about that too.
I don't want to live there either, because the having to live between the shift between magic and technology would be very uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah.
So probably the Grave Witch series.
Man, that's a great choice.
Mm-hmm.
My initial thought was the Mercy Thomson world.
Mm-hmm.
Just because magic is out in the open there now. I don't know if that's a spoiler, but spoiler alert. But I think it'd be very fun to see how, the world works there now that it is. Because we only get glimpses of it. We can see through Mercy's eyes how it is.
Yeah.
But from an outsider's perspective, I'd love to see how it works that way too. Joe Schmo in South Carolina, how does he view the world?
Yeah.
So I think it'd just be interesting to visit that world. Plus, I'd love to meet Mercy.
Me too.
She's great. She's a good character. So
she is. Good person.
I think I would visit the Mercy Thompson world. But I thought about Kate Daniels.
Okay.
Because that world is so interesting, the way that they built it.
Yeah.
So
neat.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm going to give you our email address, because that's where you have to email us once you leave your review for us. eat.drink.write.podcast@gmail.com. Go ahead and enter so you can win some good stuff. We have Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and
Patreon.
Oh, please visit our Patreon. patreon.com/EDW podcast. We could use your support. It does cost money to do these podcasts, and any help that you can give us would be greatly appreciated.
Definitely.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.